Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Branding has emerged as a key lever for startups in recent times. We've seen founders prioritize what was previously considered something only big companies do. There's been plenty of interest in terms of how a startup can build a brand, who do they hire, what do they measure, and how do they know even if all of this is working and such. I couldn't think of anyone more eminently qualified than Meeta Malhotra to address these things. Meeta has worked with some of the most iconic Indian brands like Airtel, Kotak Bank, Bru Coffee, Vistara Airlines and Infosys. In her 2-decade career, she has led a design agency, Ray+Keshavan, which she exited to WPP. She built one of the early SaaS companies, Kinetic Glue, which was then brought over by BMC Software, a Fortune 500 company. And along the way, she has invested in and advised startups. Her latest creation is Hard Copy, where she studies digitally native brands in the Indian startup ecosystem. We spoke about how founders can build and leverage a brand and all of the other nuances associated with it in this very comprehensive conversation. I hope you like it. Hi Meeta, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey Roshan, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So Meeta, you have an interesting and sort of unconventional background. You've led a design firm before. You've started one of the first known SaaS companies, which was Kinetic Glue. You've been an angel investor as well, invested in, Your Story, Let's Venture and those kind of companies. And now with Hard Copy, you're building a resource for digitally native brands. I'd love to know more about all of this. And also, when you look back on this journey, what are some key learnings that you think you've had?
So unlike the very driven young people today who I admire greatly, I have to say that my journey has been largely about serendipity, right? So I think that when I'm interested in something, then and an opportunity comes along and I like the people who I'll be working with, I just jump in, feet first, and I don't think about it too much, which I think is not possibly the best way to do it. So if I go right back to the early days, I started my career straight out of college with a master's in economics with a computer magazine called Data Quest, because I've always been interested in technology, and that was India's actually first tech media company. And I went from there to Infosys. So really got the opportunity to see a great company being built ground up. It was a very small company at that time, and I was part of the comms team. Went from there, like you said, to the agency, where we had the privilege of building some of India's biggest brands, Airtel, Vistara Airlines, Kotak Bank, Bru Coffee. It was a very heady time, 2000 to 2015. A lot, globalization was at its peak, and a lot of India's household names were being built then, and we were lucky enough to be part of those journeys. We exited the agency, my business partner and I, we sold to WPP. And then I was itching, Roshan, to build a product. So this is the thing, right? When I talk to people, when you have that, when you constantly want to build something, and I'm afraid that I have that malaise, it's very hard to stop. So I said, I've been a consultant for a decade and a half, and now I want to build something of my own. So with a co-founder from the Valley, we built Kinetic Glue, which was an early Slack. It was an enterprise collaboration software. We got off to a good start. We had Airtel, Fortis, Yes Bank, L&T, some very large enterprise customers. And we exited that to BMC Software, which is a Fortune 500 company. And after that, I was at a bit of a loose end. I wasn't sure what to do. And I was very fortunate because many of the large venture capital firms who I'd worked with as a consultant earlier asked me to come in and look at the startups in their portfolios. And they said that, look, this whole brand design, storytelling is something that startups are not very good at, and we are, can you just come in and help? And it was an interesting mix of models where I did angel investments, I did some equity swaps for services. It was a mix at that time. I'm talking about 2015, 16. And again, it was super interesting because I was able to be part of these companies, really be in the trenches with them, see how marketing was changing. So honestly, it was amazing learning and enjoyed every minute of it. So that's the long answer to that long, since I'm a very old person, a very long journey. And I'll answer your last bit very quickly, which is the hard copy. Yeah. And right now, I think perhaps with the time that you started your podcast, I started the hard copy. It was December 2019 is when we launched. So we've had about a year and 3 months of publishing. And yeah, the idea, the reason to start it was exactly what you said, to build a resource where large and small brands, but digitally native, could come and learn about the basics of brand building and also monitor how things are changing in this industry.
Right. So from data quest to hard copy, I think you've come full circle in some sense. Right?
That is so true. It's so funny. Yeah. Who knew?
Yeah. So what is, what has been your experience running hard copy? You could talk about certain nuances of the business itself, and also talk about some of the things you've noticed while, curating brand building across some of these startups and so on.
Sure. So I think that let's talk about the good part and the tough part. And I think the good part is that we've had an overwhelming reaction. So we exceeded all our readership figures. We now have 20,000 plus subscribers to our newsletter, highly engaged community. My favorite part of the day is to go and read the comments on the stories, of which there are many, very opinionated, lots of them, pushing back, saying you didn't do this properly, you didn't cover this properly. So very, just so happy that we have this audience who clearly there is a space for what we're trying to do. And as with any startup, that is hugely reassuring. The hard part, sorry, you were going to say something?
No, go on, please.
Yeah. So the hard part is the fact that all of the things we're trying to do is primary information. It doesn't exist. So if you are going to look at startup case studies on branding and growth and design in India, what are you going to find?
Right.
And yet there are so many, every reference to virality is a Dropbox case study. Every reference to content marketing is a HubSpot case study. So that is part of the reason I started the hard copy also. There's no documentation. Nobody asks the right questions. And that's why there is no sharing and learning. Right now, I think the best place for startups to learn is possibly following the right people on Twitter. There's a lot of learning in Twitter threads. Yeah. But, what we're trying to do is give it a home, give it a place where you can come and learn about the things that other people have done and what has worked and what has not worked. So I would say that getting people to share has been, it's been a journey.
Right.
It's not so easy.
No, that's absolutely right. I think over the last couple of decades, we have built that institutional knowledge, right? Because I feel like even around 2012, 2013, we would look at the valley for some of these things, right? So what metrics, what milestones, how to do this, how to do that. But right now, I think there's an Indian precedence for plenty of these things. If you take SaaS, for example, we have a thriving SaaS ecosystem right now. And there's so much of institutional knowledge, right? I mean, how do you hire a VP of sales, for example, right? People can share these examples. And brand building over the last couple of decades, especially as our aspirations itself have grown, we've moved from a sort of a builder's mindset to a seller's mindset also in some sense, right?
Right. But how do you, and I think for me, because, my early days with Infosys, what I'm delighted about is the shift from a services mindset to a product mindset. Yeah. To me, that's the biggest shift, But I ask that how can you build successful products if you don't build successful brands and you can't do good communications and storytelling, right? The two are intrinsically linked. So brand, product, design, all of them lead to growth. And I think there's so much, it's so murky. All of these concepts are so murky in people's heads.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. I think even if you look at some of the Valley firms, I mean, invariably you would find Indians as VP of engineering, VP of tech, or whatever.
Right.
But now, I mean, you're seeing a lot more Indian brands go global as well.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about all of that in further detail as we move along. But let's start with a 101 lesson on brand building and storytelling. So you work with some of the largest consumer and financial services brands like Airtel, Kotak Bank, Bru Coffee, Vistara, and so on, right? So you've also had that Infosys stint early in your career. You worked with other technology brands like ThoughtWorks and Wipro as well. Could you share with us some 101 lessons on brand building?
Sure. So I think that I want to, rather than saying this is 101 lessons, what I'd like to do is, because I tend to always believe that startup founders are just very smart folk and who are already, they already have some sense of brand and what they're going to do. What happens in my experience, and I talk to a lot of founders every week, every day, is that they are just confused by the jargon and the multiple concepts and the gazillion frameworks floating out there. So my effort is always just to simplify things and say, this is not rocket science. We've been doing this in some form or the other for centuries now as human beings who produce and make things, right? So let's break it down to its fundamental. Yeah. If you're a startup, what are the two things that you should be looking to get? You should be looking to get mind share and you should be looking to get market share, right? Very simple. Those are two terms that don't need any further explanation. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. So let's talk about mind share first. Now, when we're talking about mind share, all that means is, how do people perceive you? What do people think about you? And I think the greatest definition that I've come across is from Bezos, who says that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So number one question, what do people say about your brand? If you're saying, first answer that question. What do they say about it currently? What do you want them to say about it? And then have a plan for covering that delta. Right? So in that first bucket of brand, what you're trying to do is really nail your story. Nail what you want people to say about your company or your product. And you need to be really clear about that. And in that, always remember that you're not doing it in a vacuum. You are doing it in a competitive world. So you can't copy someone else. You always have to answer the question, why should somebody be using you versus competitive alternatives? And there are many competitive alternatives. So step number one, figure out what your brand positioning is, which is, loosely translated into what people should say about you when you're not in the room. And that should be based on why people should use your product and not your competition. And again, when I talk about competition, I really want to clarify what people get wrong is they're looking at other startups as competition. Right. In my experience, the most, let me give you an example from hard copy, which I quote very often. So we are trying to get our, we're a very remote team. Everybody works in different time zones and I've been trying to get people to move to Notion. And I can't.
Yeah.
Nobody is going to move. Everybody is stuck on Google Docs. So, that is like so many things. I mean, Excel is perhaps the most fierce competitor that a SaaS company can have, a young SaaS company. Yeah. Right?
No, this is exactly what I was telling my team yesterday as well. Actually, the biggest competition for us is inertia, right? Not wanting to do anything because change is quite often, quite difficult. And even though you can make it seamless and frictionless, and everything is see, click, and buy these days. Ultimately, you need that ounce of energy from someone to take that step. Yeah.
Exactly. It's that very famous, now almost a cliche. Netflix said their competition is cheap.
Yeah.
Right. So I think about when you're, when a startup is doing positioning, think about who's your competition. Then think about what is the message that you want to send. And of course, most importantly, who is this message for? Because it can't be for everyone, right? So very important that you have to zone in on your audience and know who are the people who are going to care about this proposition that you are talking about the most. I'll give you another example. And, I always, we'll talk about this maybe later, but I always think that the one sad thing which we're trying to bridge at hard copy is that the sort of established large companies don't talk to the startup world and vice versa. And there are so many lessons to be learned from these, right? So let's take this is an example I like to give often. When we go out and do research, and I've done research for decades now in the market, whenever we ask any demographic, young or, not very young, but say, 25 and above, we say, what is the one Indian brand that you trust the most? What do you think our answer is always?
It depends on what demographic, right? I think Tata.
25 plus.
25 plus?
Yeah.
Infosys?
No.
Okay.
Across India, Tata.
Tata, right.
Yeah. Because a lot of people in small towns would not have heard of Infosys, right? So literally everybody says that they trust Tata. And yet Tata had one of the worst positioning disasters in the world, right? Which is the Nano. So if you think about their positioning, right? So let's think about the three components of positioning that we just spoke about, which is, what you're setting out to do, what your competition is offering, and what is the value that you're bringing to the audience that you've identified. Where did they go wrong? As a company, they were setting out to build, there's this very famous story of how Ratan Tata saw a family on a scooter in a Bombay monsoon. And he said that why can't we build a car that somebody who today can only buy a scooter could afford with a little bit of stretch.
Right.
And they, it's not confirmed data, but anecdotally that was the basis for the Nano. So very sound reasoning. Where they went, the proposition the proposition they came up with was to say that this is a 1 lakh rupee car.
Yeah.
And they thought that the value was evident, right? I mean, here's a cheap car. Why would the millions and millions of Indians not buy it? They didn't get it right because the millions and millions of Indians don't want to be told that they're cheap.
Yeah.
So, it is just that. You have to be aware of how your audience thinks and what is of value to them.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things I want to pick up on from whatever you said. Sorry, you were saying something?
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. Couple of things. One is having that clarity in framing that brand statement, right? Is there a framework that you advise people use? I know that you said, disregard all the frameworks and everything, but typically, founders, they tend to be obsessed with the product and they will start with the product, right? So they will say cutting edge, cloud native, this, that, whatever, and it will be a 20-word line, right? How do they get to, framing that simple, effective, powerful statement that can have that sort of a recall that, they don't have to necessarily be in a room for people to even think of that statement and say those things about the brand, right? So that is one thing. Second thing is in terms of antagonizing certain demographics, right? And saying that, look, I am super relevant for this particular section of the target group. I'm not really relevant for those others, right? Making that call very distinctly and how important that is. So if you could touch upon these two in further detail, that would be great.
Sure. So I think that your first question is answered by that when you start to do your positioning, I would urge you not to talk about what you do, but what you can do for the customer. So this is a very simple shift, right? What does your list of 20 features, what does it bring to the customer? What is the value that you are delivering to that customer that will make her choose your product over the other alternatives? That's a simple enough framework. And I think that anyone can sit down with their teams over a coffee or a beer and answer this question.
Right.
What is I'm going to repeat it. What is the value that you offer to your identified market that your competitors do not? And how does that value make, why is it useful to your target audience? In the Amazon shareholder newsletter, which just was published a couple of days ago, it's really interesting how, sorry to go on about Jeff Bezos, but since it just happened and it's timely, he framed it in a really interesting way. He said that the value that Amazon is bringing to customers is time. They're now able to, and he's given the stats and I don't remember them, but they're now able to complete a task in X minutes versus X hours that it would take for them to go buy that from a store. So, right, he's, even after all those successes and even after all those years, he's very crisply articulating what is the proposition to customers. And he's reinforcing it yet again.
Yeah,
so,
that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so think like that. Just say, why would this customer choose me?
Right.
And once you and the best thing to do is to really ask customers. See, this is the one thing that is a pet peeve. Startups don't talk to their customers enough. And the reason is, I think that we are awash in this sea of seductive metrics like click-through rates and conversion rates and all of that. And, at the other end, whether you're a B2C company or a B2B company, at the other end of it, your success is determined by human beings. Whether it's your customer, whether it's your investor, whether it's your employees, they're all human beings. And the most important thing you can, the most important habit you can inculcate in yourself and in your teams is to learn to go and speak to your customers. So the best way to test that positioning, do it with your team and then stress test it. Go speak to customers and see if it resonates with them, see if it makes sense. And you don't need to do any expensive market research. You just need to call up 10, 15, 20 prospects or existing customers, and you will see the patterns emerging.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. I think we've spoken about this earlier in the podcast, that people tend to overestimate the quantifiable metrics and underestimate the qualitative metrics as such. People like to look at funnels and that kind of dashboards and whatnot, and grossly underestimate how valuable it could be to talk to like 20 of their users randomly, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
absolutely. And there's just nothing more valuable. In fact, that is something that I think startups learn to, they must learn from the older, more established companies.
Yeah.
So in a Unilever, for example, when you are hired as a management graduate, you have to go out into the field. Like for 1 year, you have to go meet distributors, meet customers, you can't sit in an office in front of a machine, regardless of what your role is.
Right. So you mentioned mind share and market share, right? Now, the nuance with branding is that not all of it translates into market share. So you cannot directly treat it as a business development activity in some sense. And mind share is very intangible value, right? What someone thinks of you, etc. You may not even realize, but there's of course value to it. Oftentimes we find startups tend to deprioritize brand building until much later, when they think that they can do this when they are bigger and supposedly they can budget for these things and so on. But we've also seen how some startups who do the opposite, for instance, let's say Cred, right, benefit immensely from, all kinds of good stuff, right? Whether it's like investor interest or whether it's user interest and so on and so forth. So if you were to make the case for why branding is essential for startups, right? How would you make that case with the founder? And when do you think they should prioritize branding?
So I think that the biggest problem is that people confuse branding with advertising.
Yeah.
So there is no, if you have customers, let me illustrate this with an anecdote. Okay. So I got a call from somebody, a founder, and he's selling, it's a D2C company, and they're selling snacks, Indian snacks, right? And he said to me that, I have a problem that my sales are good. He was touching like almost a 5 crore GMV, which is great, with the, completely bootstrapped.
Nice.
But he said, I don't have a brand and I don't even know where to start, and I don't have a brand. And now I've finished with my, I'm in the sense my team understands how to grow, but now I think I need a brand. So how do I go about this? And I think that is such a common question that everybody asks, because they think that let's put brand aside and let's just focus on growth and we'll worry about brand later, as you said. But that's such a fallacy, because I said to him, do you have any repeat customers? And he said, yeah, of course. Like, what kind of a question is that? I couldn't have reached 5 crores without repeat customers. So I said, well, if you have repeat customers, then you have a brand, because they have some perception of you in their heads. That's why they've come back and bought again. It's not like they saw a Facebook ad, they clicked, they liked, they bought, but they've completely forgotten who they bought from or what they bought. And it was just that one-off thing, and it's never going to happen again.
Yeah.
If they obviously have some thought in their heads about you, the problem, which means that you already have a brand. So what is the problem? The problem is not that you don't have a brand. The problem is that you don't know what people think about you. And if you don't know what people think about you, you can't shape that narrative. That's number one. That's the number one issue. In my case, for building a brand. And the number two issue, let's talk about growth. So I told her, I said, now growth is a fairly, it's been studied a lot. And I think it's fairly well established that there are only a handful of ways in which a company can grow. And what are those ways, right? So there's paid marketing, right? The favorite of all startups, like turn on the Facebook, Google tab. There's paid marketing. There's, for want of a better word, virality, where things, spread through word of mouth. Okay. Then for larger companies, particularly in the SaaS and B2B space, there is sales outreach, but we're not talking about that right now. And then there is content, where you through SEO or social media or whatever, you create inbound interest, right? And people come and try your brand, and you acquire customers by creating content that attracts people. Right. So this is largely the world. You come from that world. This is largely the world of growth, right? There are very few other levers that you can press for long-term growth. Now, what I say to people is, if you haven't, all of these involve some kind of storytelling. If something has to go viral, what is that thing that is going to go viral? What is that story? If you're going to create content, what content are you going to create? If you're going to run paid ads, what do your ads say beyond picture of product or discount? You're going to have to move past that stage. That's not a sustainable stage, right? So if your sales teams are going to go and make a presentation, what is it that they're going to sell? How can you do this unless you have a brand and unless you have a story? How can you do this effectively? What you will do is, if you haven't put the brand piece in place, you will constantly do things that are not thought through, that are not consistent, that will change from campaign to campaign, that will change from team to team. And you will create a leaky bucket where you will acquire customers at the top of the funnel, and they'll keep dropping off at the bottom, because your whole funnel is just not consistent.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point, because I find like this product versus brand is such a false dichotomy in some sense, right? Because unless you understand why someone is buying your product, how will you even double down on all of the good stuff, right?
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't give you a product roadmap. It doesn't give you a basis for growth. It doesn't give you anything until you first figure out what is that story, and it can keep changing. See, the thing is, what I see with young founders also is this commitment phobia. So they're like, this is a question I get asked a lot. They're like, yeah, but think about this, right? We decide on a story and then we spend money on it. And then a year later, I'm going to pivot. And today I'm doing an AI powered XYZ. And next year I'll do an AI powered PQR. And all of the money that I will have spent on branding is a waste. Right. So I say that, again, why do they say that? It's because of they haven't understood what that brand is really about, right? And I tell them that, listen, the brand is about why you are so good at doing that AI powered whatever else, whatever it could be. It's like I gave this example recently of a car company, right? You buy into first the brand of the company, right? And then you look at what their different models are. And of course, people have introduced models and withdrawn them, and some have been successful and some have been failures. And that kind of product pivot will continue through the life of any company. But essentially what you stand for, if you can just communicate that and keep evolving as you go along. It's not a static thing. As you grow, as you get more feedback, as your portfolio expands, as your ambitions expand, of course, that will shape shift, but that is no reason to not make that initial investment. Right. And I'm talking about not money investment. I'm talking about time and energy and mindshare investment.
Right. I guess it's an evolution in some sense, right? I mean, even if we look at some of the most iconic brands, arguably they are saying slightly different things compared to what they were saying 5 or 10 years back.
Definitely.
So, yeah. I've also been very curious about how B2B brands have started prioritizing brand, right? So Drift, for example, I mean, might as well say website chat, right? But then they call themselves conversational marketing, and they built an entire category by themselves. Yeah. Or even if you go back and look at Salesforce with the whole no cloud sort of evangelism, no software sort of evangelism that they did.
Yeah.
It's again pure brand, right? You could argue that it's a great product and whatnot, but it was built on the back of a very strong brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So any recent case studies that you've documented on the hard copy on, how some of the early stage startups have leveraged brand?
So I think right now we are doing, for some reason, a lot of the stuff that's coming our way is, B2C companies. And I think that, I know the reason is also obvious because, a lot of that stuff is out in the market and so gets noticed, and therefore it's easier to document. We definitely intend to go all out behind B2B in the next few months and create a, completely separate section because there are so many stories to be told. But I think category creation is just a very interesting thing. Technology is allowing you to do it now for the very first time and we are seeing, I would say, when I step back and look at what's happening in India, I think that the most interesting category creation is happening in the fintech space, as well as the B2B space, the productivity space, not so much in the B2C, but say a Postman or companies like that. So I think that we haven't looked at those case studies carefully yet, but certainly in the B2C startups that we are seeing, there is a lot of attempt at trying to do things very early on and we don't know, what will be the final fate of these startups, right? It's very, very early. But I still think it's very interesting. And if you look at the case studies on hard copy right now, there's a company like The Whole Truth, which does protein bars, and their approach to brand storytelling, which is very, very different. They've taken an extremely aggressive, route to it, which is great, and it's getting them noticed, and it's got them a lot of initial traction. Even if I go beyond the hard copy and, Roshan, if we talk about what happened recently. So just yesterday, there was this whole spoof on the Cred ad, right? Which was done by Magic Pin. And it's got talked about so much. And I am just looking at this, and we ran a survey, a poll on it in our Instagram. We have about, I think, 10,000 plus people on our Instagram handle, and every poll we run gets 2,000 plus responses. So I think it's a very good target audience. And as I'm looking at it right now, the results are that almost 70% think that it was a good idea for them to do.
Right.
Right. So here's an example of somebody who decided to try something quite different. I don't know if this is answering your question, but a company that decided to try something quite different, they're getting flack for it. No doubt. There are enough people saying that it was a very bad idea. But if you look at the Google trends for them, it has spiked like crazy in 24 hours, the search.
Yeah.
So now whether they will convert that into, long-term benefit, I don't know. But certainly I didn't know anything about Magic Pin before. I mean, I vaguely knew they existed, but that's it. Now I have some perception of them in my head.
Yeah.
Okay, who are these guys? Right? And they're cheeky. So it's better to have that. Now what they will do with it, I don't know.
Yeah.
And if they don't do anything with it, that perception will fade and, that spike will go down. But certainly they've done something.
Yeah. I mean, at least people are talking about them, right? So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And if that was the purpose, then, they've achieved it. Now, if that was not the purpose, and it's certainly not going to bring them long-term growth, they'll have to do a lot more now to actually keep that momentum growing.
Right. You spoke about something interesting that I want to, talk about in further detail, which is the whole category creation, right? Especially as we are seeing the cloud grow, there are multi-billion-dollar markets getting built for software that previously did not exist.
Yeah.
I mean, who could have predicted Slack's success, right? $27, $28 billion, whatever they got sold for. Earlier, I think while people dreaded being early in the market, now folks are looking at it as an opportunity to build a category by itself and kind of own that category. In some sense, you've been there with the kinetic glue, right? You could kind of think of it as a precursor for all of the enterprise collaboration stuff that's happening right now.
Right.
What is some of the advice that you would offer in this regard for someone who's looking to build a category?
So I think it's very interesting because in one sense, it's the holy grail, right? Which startup founder doesn't want to build a category? It's the most exciting thing to do. And on the other hand, it's incredibly hard. So it's almost like, what is that pill you take in the Matrix, right? I mean,
red pill.
Yeah, the red pill. So it's very hard. And I think that, category creation requires a couple of things, which are a bit counterintuitive in that sense. One is that on the one hand, it requires you to disregard what people are saying because the category doesn't exist, and therefore, there will automatically, human beings like patterns, and there will automatically be a lot of naysayers who will say that what is this, and this can't be done, and this can't, this will not work, and all of that negative feedback you'll hear. And on the other hand, you have to keep yourself open to constantly touching base with and understanding your potential customers. Because at the end of the day, you are not, I know we like to say that they created a category, but I like to say that a category got created because there was a customer need for that, which was so far not addressed. Right? So if you'll have to do both of those things, which are quite hard. Disregard a lot of people and yet understand who are the people that you constantly have to stay in touch with, because they will help you create that new category.
Yeah. And as a category grows, I mean, it's bound to get splintered, right? I mean, there's this whole bundling and unbundling which keeps happening. It's kind of the way of the world, I would say, right? So
100%. It depends at, what point in history you are building your product. Whether it's the unbundling phase or the bundling phase.
Right, exactly. So, with all of what you've said, now that you've managed to convince a founder who's listening to the podcast to prioritize branding, right? How should they go about it? Who do they hire? What should they do? What should they measure, etc. Right? I mean, of course, in the current situation, I'm not sure if they'll be able to go out and get a coffee or a beer with people. But how should they go about it?
So let's break that up into a couple of things. And when I say, so let's talk about team first. It really depends on what stage your startup is at, right? If you're at an early stage, what you'd be looking for is to hire performance marketing people, and the mantle of brand positioning and building really falls on the founders. It's very hard. You're not going to go out and hire a CMO at an early stage. What you need are people. If you need help, then obviously the first place to augment your team is growth.
Right.
So which means that you have to be the one thinking about brand. And you can hand that off only later, once you have the luxury to be able to hire somebody who's going to be looking at it all the time. And this is what I've seen with the best startups. The founders are obsessed with brand. So that's the number one, that's the hiring question. The second question is, how do you do it? You may not be able to meet your customers, but you can talk to them on the phone, or you can set up a Zoom call. And in fact, I've been hearing from startups that this is a really good time to touch base with customers, because everyone's at home and everyone has extra time. And, everyone, all the founders I've spoken to, where I've said, I'm not going to speak to you till you speak 20 customers and come back. I've actually come back in, 3 or 4 days and said, we've managed to speak to 20 customers, because everyone's like, yeah, we have time. We're not going to office. We're not commuting. So, number one, understand if you're a young founder, the responsibility is yours.
Right.
And tell your team that you're in it together. Number two, please talk to your customers. If you are confused, first do that. First talk to your customers and understand, why do they use your product? Why do they buy from you? You will see patterns emerging. You will hear things that will allow you to create the foundation for your brand. Then sit down with your team, follow that very simple thing. What value are you delivering? Why should they not use your competition? What can you give them that nobody else can? And arrive at a brand story. And then take that very consistently through your experience. Now, this is again something that people think you need a lot of money to do. Totally don't agree. Your experience can be something as small as the onboarding email that you write to your employee.
Right.
To, what you do with your customer once they buy from you. That's a whole other animal, retention, which startups really are not good at. And if only they would think about customer experience a little more, they could get retention going. So every little piece of that experience, if you think about whether you're B2B or B2C, if you just try to make that consistent with your brand story, that's enough for now.
Right. Yeah. Having these customer conversations is also a fantastic way to get people invested in your brand, right? I mean, yeah, when you have these conversations, in some sense, you're shifting positions, and instead of like a very sales conversation where someone has their guard up or something, you're brainstorming with the person on how to solve a particular problem, right? And their problem at that, right?
Correct.
And the other thing that I also kind of gleaned from whatever you said was to augment all of your brand messaging, sort of ground it with demand, right? So if people are looking for something and people are buying you for something, say maybe related things, right? It sort of acts as a moral compass in some sense for the brand itself, right?
Absolutely, because that's the final truth, right? When somebody actually buys you once, then comes back and buys again. I would say that stop everything and sit and talk to that person and understand why and what made them come back and choose you. They have really invested a lot in you. They have put their faith and trust in you. And that means that is already your brand.
Right.
Understand what it is. You can't build it in a vacuum.
Right. Something else that you said is also very, very important, which is oftentimes, people think that, okay, brand ends with, maybe a fancy logo and like a stated purpose or whatever it is, and, taking these messages across Twitter or elsewhere. But engineering those touch points along the life cycle of a customer, right? How the person is onboarded, for example, how they experience the product, and then what happens in case of a service issue. And then, how you're actually getting them to endorse you or refer you to new customers, all of that stuff, right? So all of these various touch points along the journey also constitute brand, right?
100%. I'll take you back to Urban Ladder, right? And whatever else may have happened with them business-wise, they built a wonderful brand. They were widely loved, and they, sort of started this whole thing of buying furniture online. And they were the very, what was one of the things that caught the attention of everybody? And I'm talking about the very early days. When somebody would come to install furniture in your house, they would bring with them a broom and a dustpan. And after the piece of furniture was installed, they would clean up. And, it was talked about so much because nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had even thought of doing that before, because typically people who come to deliver furniture leave a huge mess for you to clean up. So, by thinking through that customer journey, and there are enough touch points on every customer journey, whether it's B2C or B2B, and just being thoughtful about it, you can create a very strong brand without having to spend a lot of money.
Right. I think one of the questions we skipped was the fact about antagonizing certain sections of your audience, right? Which is how does a founder make a choice between being everything for everyone versus being something really special for someone in particular, right? And how they should go about doing this, because in the early days, it's very difficult to refuse business. It's almost counterintuitive, right? So founders tend to grow very broad, right? How do they sort of converge on their target, target group as such, and how do they double down on who they should specifically target?
So I think that who you are building your product for, I'm assuming that the TAM has been part of your, early calculations. When you build so I want to separate the two. When you build your brand, you focus very hard on a specific audience, right? And all your messaging, all your storytelling, all of that is for that specific person. And that's why, there is this practice of using personas in marketing, right? You create personas of your potential customers, whether it's a large number of personas if you're a B2C brand, or a small number of personas which you're doing for the decision makers in a B2B buying cycle. So that's when you go really, really narrow. That is when you say that all of the messaging that I'm doing, all of the things that I'm selling to is for these people. And I don't think that any startup has the luxury of saying, I'll just pray and I'll wait and see what happens. There are very few very large companies, like say your payment companies, for instance, right? A Paytm or a PhonePe, where almost every Indian is their customer.
Right.
Correct? But those are the exceptions. I think that you have to, as a startup, the best and smartest way to grow is to first identify who is that initial early adopter, focus on them very, very hard, and then grow out from there. Then later, as you have more resources, as you have, more teams, more money, then if you add other audiences, that's fine. But I think that it would be a very big mistake to start out broad when you're small, because you'll spread yourself too thin and you'll be exhausted.
Great point. Yeah. The other nuance is in terms of who or what you're competing against, right? A lot of the time startups are going up against an incumbent in a market, which is a larger, more conventional player, right, with more market share. We've seen some startups play the whole David versus Goliath story really well, and thumb their noses at the larger rivals. Like, for example, Salesforce did that with Oracle back in the day with their whole no software movement and so on, right? And some of the younger brands are trying to do that with the older incumbents right now. My question is, what are the dynamics of being a challenger brand, and what would you say one should do or not do in that situation?
So I think on this David versus Goliath thing, that then Freshworks did it to Salesforce, right? So they did the whole Failforce campaign. If you're going to take that route, you have to be very clear that you have the personality and the tenacity to follow it through. So don't do small, meaningless things, because then you're just like, you're an irritant and you will just ruin your brand in the market and you'll not gain anything out of it. So I think whether it was Salesforce against Oracle or Freshworks against Salesforce, they were all concerted, well thought through, entertaining campaigns. And they worked because of that, right? So if you can pull it off, that's great, but do it knowing that it is not going to be something you do for the rest of your life. These are all very short-lived things, and you do it to garner attention very quickly. And you have to have, like I said, the personality to pull it off. And you have to know that this will soon die a natural death. And you have to move on from being a brand that points out the faults of others to then standing on your own feet and making it very clear why people should be using you, like what's good about you.
Right. That's a great point again. I mean, so initially I think startups solve a problem by saying, hey, you know what, you're using this big software and that doesn't do X, Y, or Z, but we do these X, Y, or Z things very well, right?
Yeah.
And then I guess, post product market fit, you have your own unique perspective on the solution on the market as such. And as you rightly pointed out, I think some of this anti-brand is not relevant as you sort of evolve in your journey, right?
No, it's very short-lived. It's only if you have, say, two very large incumbents like an Apple and a Microsoft that it continues for as long as it has. But those are the exceptions. I think for the audience that we are addressing, right. If you have that personality and you're willing to stick it out for a little bit of time, because you'll get a lot of flack and you have to be able to withstand that, and you're very clear about why you're doing it. You're clear that you're doing it to have this frame of reference which allows people to evaluate your offering against an incumbent, and you know that it's short-lived, then you can try it.
Right. Final couple of questions. I know we are over time. One of the things that has become really important of late is personal brand, right? You've seen a lot of startups where the founder is a brand in itself, in himself or herself, right? You can say that, Mark Benioff is Salesforce, Salesforce is Mark Benioff, right? Or how Kunal Shah is with Cred and so on. How important do you think it is to develop a personal founder brand? And how should you say, someone should align this to their strategic objectives of the startup itself?
See, again, what we talked about for brand goes for personal brands as well. So if you are a founder of a relatively unknown company and no one knows you, that's one thing. But as you start to scale, people will get to know you, right? And they will form some perception of you, even if that perception is to say, oh, he's like a very quiet, under the radar person. Even that is a brand. Right? So what people make the mistake often is to think that a brand only means that I need to have 1 million followers on Twitter.
Right.
No, I mean, you can be a very quiet person who nobody has ever interviewed, and that's your brand.
Actually, that's a very interesting point. So what you're saying is, I mean, typically we think of founder brands as someone who's super extroverted and, who keeps talking all the time, right? Very public with their views and so on. But what you're saying is you could also have an antithesis of that, right? Which is someone who's a lot more introverted, quieter, seen at the right places, or seen at some very specific places and circumstances also.
Right. Let's look at, I'm sure everybody has heard of DMart, right? It's one of the most successful retail companies in the country. And their founder has never given an interview. No one knows anything about him.
Right.
So, but he's, that's a brand by itself.
Right.
So I think that, again, it comes down to who you are, what you want, what is your personality type like.
Right.
Honestly, there are very few people who are successful in building large followings on social media. Right? So if that is something that comes naturally to you, if you enjoy it, then of course it brings with it many benefits. You almost create your own distribution. You're able to manage perception. People notice you. You build in public. All of those things. And if like I said, if you're the kind of person who does it and enjoys it, sure, it will bring an added dimension to your startup. You will get noticed more easily. But, for all the people out there who don't like it, who don't want to post 3 times a day, it doesn't mean you can't build a brand or a successful business. Please. Like 99% of people don't do it. Like how much of India is on Twitter? We forget all these things. And yet so many people have built very, very successful businesses.
Right. What you're saying is not to ignore brand. I mean, you can be conscious of it, but sort of look at it in a different way, different persona, for example.
Yeah. Let it be authentic.
Yeah.
First, figure out, be aware of who you are as a founder and as a person, right? And then if you're the kind of person who wants to share on social media, then go ahead and do it. If you're the kind of person who would just rather be much quieter and only share within the team, then go ahead and do it. Be aware of who you are, what you want the world to know about you. Be very mindful about that and then stick to that strategy.
Right. Meeta, this has been a fascinating conversation. A lot of nuances uncovered on brand building and so on and so forth. I'd love to talk to you for another hour, but then I'm sure there's a limitation of time. So my final question is you've seen the startup scene over the last couple of decades, and how have you seen this ecosystem evolve? What are you optimistic for going forward?
I'm very optimistic because of 2 things. First, I think that when I started looking and working with startups, there was very little understanding of brand and marketing. It was only about top line growth because that is what got you funding. And a lot of the startup founders were first time entrepreneurs with no backgrounds in building a business. And I think a lot of the, as we all say, a lot of the startup funds went to Google and Facebook. And there was just this whole thing of acquire customers, but we don't understand how to tell them a story. We don't understand what our brand stands for. We don't understand retention. And we've been through that cycle. Thankfully, it's behind us, I think. And now there's just so much more focus on brand building, on what customers say about you, on really understanding what the lifetime value of a customer is. So now even very young founders are talking in terms like that, and that's so heartening. I'm so happy about that. I think that we are building some amazing products. We always had great technical chops, but now we are seeing products, we are seeing design, we are seeing branding emerge in India that is as good, if not better than anywhere else in the world. So very optimistic.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end the podcast on. Thank you so much, Meeta. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.